10 days. 10 days in the jungle with the Australian Special Air Service, and the Navy SEAL did not hear a single word spoken out loud. Not a whisper, not a murmur, not a name called across a clearing or a warning shouted through the trees. 10 days of communication conducted entirely through touches on the shoulder, subtle hand movements, and signals so small that a man standing 3 meters away would miss half of them. When the SEAL returned to his American base, he sat down and wrote a report that would circulate through classified channels for years. The essence of it could be reduced to 2 words: we're amateurs. And this was not some green recruit fresh from training. This was a veteran operator from SEAL Team 1, a man who had been through Army Ranger School, Raider School, and multiple combat deployments. A man who believed, until those 10 days in the bush, that American Special Operations represented the pinnacle of unconventional warfare. The Australians dismantled that belief without saying a word. But the silence was only the surface of something far deeper, because underneath that silence lay a fundamental disagreement between 2 allied nations about how wars should be fought, who should give orders, and what happens when the most powerful military on Earth tells its smallest ally to fall in line, and that ally simply refuses. This is the story of the night the Australian SAS went quiet on American command. Not quiet in the jungle, quiet on the radio. The night they stopped answering, stopped reporting, stopped coordinating, and conducted operations so far outside the boundaries of American doctrine that the Pentagon spent decades pretending it never happened. Stay with me. To understand why a handful of Australians could defy the entire American command structure in Vietnam and get away with it, you have to understand the peculiar arrangement that brought them there in the first place. In April 1966, the first Australian task force arrived in Vuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. It was a brigade-sized formation, roughly 4,500 men at its peak, operating from a rubber plantation at a place called Nui Dat. And from the moment they set foot on Vietnamese soil, the Australians had negotiated something that no other Allied force in Vietnam possessed: independence. The deal had been hammered out between Lieutenant General John Wilton, the head of the Australian military, and General William Westmoreland, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam. The Australians would fall under the operational control of the U.S. Second Field Force, a corps-level headquarters in Bien Hoa. But they would not be attached to an American division. They would not take direct orders from American battalion or brigade commanders. They would operate as an independent command with their own tactical area of responsibility, their own rules of engagement, and their own methods. The key phrase in the agreement was operational control, not command. There is a difference, and the Australians understood that difference with the precision of lawyers and the stubbornness of mules. Operational control meant the Americans could assign them missions and areas. It did not mean the Americans could tell them how to execute those missions, and it was in the how that everything would fracture. The American way of war in Vietnam was built on principles that had won the Second World War and held the line in Korea. Find the enemy, fix him in position, destroy him with overwhelming firepower, speed, aggression, mass, move in large units supported by artillery, helicopter gunships, and close air support, measure success in body counts, report everything up the chain, maintain constant radio contact. The system demanded information flowing upward at all times. Every platoon reported to every company to every battalion to brigade, brigade to division, division to corps, Corps to Saigon. The radio never stopped. The American command apparatus was a vast organism that breathed through communication, and if the communication stopped, the organism panicked. The Australian approach was something else entirely. It had been forged not in the great industrial wars of the 20th century, but in the small wars that the British Empire had fought on its colonial margins and that Australia had inherited and refined. The Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1960. The Indonesian Confrontation in Borneo from 1963 to 1966. In Malaya, Australian and British forces had spent 12 years fighting communist insurgents in jungle so dense that conventional military operations were useless. They learned that small patrols of highly trained men could achieve what battalions could not. They learned that patience was a weapon, that silence was a weapon, that the absence of information could be more valuable than its presence because the enemy could not track what he could not detect. In Borneo, the Australian SAS had taken these lessons further. During the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966, they conducted cross-border operations into Indonesian territory, codenamed Claret Operations, patrols so secret that the Australian government denied they happened for decades. 2 SAS squadron alone mounted 45 patrols on both sides of the border during a single 4-month deployment. They operated in 4- and 5-man teams, deep inside hostile territory for weeks at a time, tracking Indonesian RPKD commandos through terrain where visibility sometimes dropped below 3 meters. They lived in the jungle for months at a stretch, learning how to track the enemy, lay ambushes, and defeat him using methods that owed more to bushcraft than to anything taught at conventional military academies. They communicated by touch. They moved at speeds that would have driven American commanders to professional fury. 3 SAS soldiers died during operations in Borneo, none from direct enemy contacts. The lesson was clear. In the jungle, noise kills, all noise, including the noise that comes from your own side. The regiment's founding in 1957 had been modest, just a single company of around 180 men, raised in Perth and modeled on the British SAS, with whom they shared the motto, "Who dares wins." By 1964, they had expanded to a full regiment of 3 Sabre squadrons, a training squadron, and headquarters. What they lacked in numbers, they compensated for, with a selection process so demanding that only 1 in 12 candidates completed it. Those who passed entered training that lasted roughly 18 months, 3 times longer than the American Special Forces pipeline of the same era. A significant portion of that training took place not in conventional military facilities, but in the Australian outback, where instructors drew on tracking traditions that stretched back tens of thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians had survived in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth by developing environmental awareness that Western military science had never attempted to codify. The SAS learned from this tradition. They learned to read ground sign. They learned to detect human presence through the behavior of birds and insects. They learned to remain motionless for periods that tested the limits of human patience. The Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam as part of the 1st Australian Task Force. 3 Sabre squadrons rotated through the country on year-long deployments, never more than about 150 men in country at any given time. Their official role was reconnaissance. They were the eyes and ears of the task force, responsible for penetrating deep into enemy-held territory, locating Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units, mapping their positions, and reporting back so that larger forces could act on the intelligence. Their unofficial reality was something the organizational charts could never capture. They were hunters, and they operated by rules that bore almost no resemblance to what American forces were doing in the same war, in the same jungles, sometimes within kilometers of each other. Australian SAS patrols went out in groups of 5 men. 5. In a war where American operations routinely involved platoons of 30, companies of 120, sometimes battalions of 500. The Australians moved through triple canopy jungle at speeds of roughly 100 meters per hour. At that pace, covering a single kilometer required an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission could take nearly a week. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRRPs, considered 2 to 3 kilometers per day an acceptable balance between stealth and urgency. The Australians looked at that speed and saw suicide. At 100 meters per hour, the patrol moved so slowly that the jungle's natural soundscape recovered completely between each step. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. Monkeys continued their calls. To any Viet Cong listening post within 1,000 meters, the area where the Australians operated sounded exactly like an area where no human beings were present. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. The movement discipline was absolute. The point man took a single step, placing his foot with precision on ground that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol froze. Complete stillness, not reduced movement, zero movement. They would remain frozen for minutes at a time, scanning their surroundings using only their eyes, never turning their heads, testing the air with subtle nostril movements, processing every sound the jungle produced. After several minutes, another step, another freeze. 4 armed men could move 50 meters through dense jungle in 30 minutes without creating a single audible disturbance. And during all of this, they did not speak, not a word. Communication happened through a system of touches so refined it functioned as a silent language. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. A tap on the arm indicated direction. There were signals for enemy contact, for danger, for rally points, for withdrawal. An American SEAL veteran named Roger Hayden, who spent 10 days on patrol with Australian SAS, later described the experience as the most intensive education in reconnaissance he had ever received. He said he learned more about fieldcraft in those 10 days than in all his previous military training combined. The Australians never spoke, not once. For 10 days, the entire patrol communicated exclusively through hand and arm signals. Hayden, a combat veteran who had been through multiple elite training programs, came away feeling that everything he thought he knew about operating in the bush was inadequate. This was the force that the American command structure was trying to integrate into its information machine. And this was where the fundamental collision began. The American system required constant reporting, radio checks, situation reports, position updates, contact reports, intelligence summaries. The radio was the umbilical cord that connected every unit in Vietnam to the vast command apparatus that stretched from jungle patrol bases to Saigon, to the Pentagon, to the White House Situation Room. Without that cord, the system could not function. It could not allocate resources. It could not coordinate supporting fires. It could not track the progress of operations. It could not feed the insatiable appetite for data that characterized American military management at every level. A general in Saigon expected to know where every company-sized element was operating at any given hour. A colonel at Corps headquarters expected real-time updates on every patrol in his sector. The information flowed upward in a ceaseless river, and anyone who dammed that river, even temporarily, even for sound tactical reasons, created institutional anxiety that escalated rapidly through the chain of command. The Australians understood radios. They carried them. They used them when necessary. But their doctrine treated radio communication as a calculated risk, not a routine obligation. Every radio transmission was a potential compromise. Every time a patrol keyed its handset, it created an electronic signature that enemy signals intelligence could detect, locate, and exploit. The Viet Cong and NVA had invested heavily in radio direction finding capabilities. They knew that American units transmitted constantly, and they used those transmissions to track patrol movements with frightening accuracy. A single radio transmission could betray a patrol's position. A pattern of transmissions could reveal its direction of travel, its speed, its likely destination. For a 5-man patrol operating deep inside enemy territory, a compromised position was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. So the Australians transmitted only when they had something worth the risk. They submitted scheduled radio checks at prearranged times, using brevity codes and burst transmissions designed to minimize their electronic footprint. They reported confirmed enemy sightings, significant intelligence, and emergency situations. They did not report routine position updates every hour. They did not chatter. They did not answer queries from headquarters that they considered unnecessary. And when the American liaison officers attached to their operations demanded more frequent reporting, more detailed updates, more compliance with the American information machine, the Australians pushed back. The pushback was not dramatic at first. It was professional, measured, and utterly immovable. Australian patrol commanders would acknowledge requests for additional reporting and then continue operating exactly as their own doctrine prescribed. They would explain patiently that increased radio traffic endangered their patrols. They would cite their training, their experience in Borneo and Malaya, and their operational results. And their operational results were difficult to argue with. During their 6 years in Vietnam, from 1966 to 1971, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. They killed at least 492 confirmed enemy fighters, with another 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses were staggering in their scarcity. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing in action, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. Around 580 men served in the SASR in Vietnam across all rotations. The kill ratio was the highest of any unit, Australian or American, in the entire war. These numbers created a problem for the American command structure. You cannot argue with results like that. You cannot tell a unit achieving those outcomes that its methods are wrong, but you also cannot incorporate those methods into a system that depends on the exact opposite approach. American doctrine needed information flowing constantly upward. Australian doctrine needed information to stop flowing entirely when the tactical situation demanded silence. These two imperatives were fundamentally incompatible. The tension built slowly through 1966 and 1967 as the Australians established their presence in Vuoc Tui province and the SAS began its long-range patrols. American liaison officers, assigned to the Australian task force reported back to their own chain of command with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The Australians were effective, undeniably, extraordinarily effective, but they were also, from the American perspective, impossible to manage. They did not report when they were supposed to report. They did not follow American communications protocols. They did not provide the constant stream of data that the American system required to function. The U.S. Higher Command, the 2nd Field Force Headquarters in Bien Hoa, never fully understood the Australian approach. Senior American officers characterized the Australian style as cautious to the point of passivity. They called it pussyfooting. They suggested the Australians were avoiding contact to keep their casualty figures low, padding their statistics, operating in areas of low strategic importance where there was little fighting to be done. These assessments revealed more about the assumptions of the men making them than about the reality of Australian operations. The Australians were not avoiding the enemy. They were dismantling the enemy so methodically that the enemy was avoiding them. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Viet Cong's D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, a unit that had aggressively engaged the American 173rd Airborne Brigade and fought at the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, gradually ceased offensive operations in areas where the SAS operated, not because the SAS had destroyed the battalion through attrition. The D445 strength had not been catastrophically reduced. Their supplies remained adequate. Their weapons were functional, but their will to fight in those areas had been broken by an enemy they could not see, could not track, and could not understand. The D445 was no paper tiger. This was the same unit that had participated in the mortar attack on the Australian base at Nui Dat in August 1966, the same unit that had fought alongside the 275th Regiment in a battle that nearly overwhelmed D Company of the 6th Royal Australian Regiment at Long Tan. At Long Tan, D Company, heavily outnumbered, held off a force of regimental strength, killing at least 245 Viet Cong while losing 18 Australians dead and 24 wounded. The battle demonstrated both the ferocity of the enemy the Australians faced and the effectiveness of Australian combined arms tactics when conventional engagement was unavoidable. But the SAS operated in a different dimension of warfare entirely. They did not seek decisive battles. They sought decisive information. And in gathering that information, they created an atmosphere of constant, invisible threat that proved more debilitating to enemy operations than any single battle could achieve. The approach extended beyond the SAS to the broader Australian task force methodology, where American strategy focused on attrition, measuring progress through body counts and territory momentarily seized. The Australians focused on disrupting the enemy's systems. Their patrols targeted enemy lines of communication and the numerous bunker systems and base camps where the Viet Cong stored food reserves. Over the course of their deployment, Australian forces captured over 1,800 enemy bunker systems and base camps. The average food captured per position fell dramatically each year, from over 1,200 kilograms in 1966 to barely 20 kilograms by 1971. The enemy's logistics network in Phuoc Tuy was being hollowed out from the inside, and the SAS reconnaissance patrols that went silent on the radio for days at a time were the primary intelligence source making this systematic dismantlement possible. The Viet Cong developed different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, their doctrine emphasized aggressive ambush at carefully chosen locations, inflicting maximum casualties in the opening moments, then withdrawing through prepared routes before American firepower could be brought to bear effectively. It was a formula they had refined over years, and it worked. Americans moved in predictable patterns. They used helicopter insertions that created detectable noise signatures from kilometers away. They moved at trackable speeds, leaving clear trails. They could be smelled from 500 meters because of the chemical signatures of their hygiene products, their deodorant, their distinctively sweet Virginia tobacco. American doctrine favored immediate escalation to heavy supporting fires, which created exploitable patterns that allowed ambush teams to withdraw before effective retaliation arrived. The Viet Cong had learned to time their engagements to the minute. Against the Australians, the guidance was radically different: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because the Australians were more likely to detect the ambush before entering it. Australian patrols could not be smelled because they had eliminated every chemical signature. They could not be heard because they moved too slowly to create sound. They could not be tracked because their counter-tracking techniques, stepping on roots and rocks rather than soft earth, walking in streams, brushing out footprints behind them, wearing sandals cut from automobile tires that left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement, made trail following impossible. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. Do not attempt pursuit, because Australian counter-tracking capabilities made following them futile and potentially fatal. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The Viet Cong had a specific term for the Australian SAS that they applied to no other Allied force: Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, jungle ghosts. The term carried connotations that exceeded ordinary military respect. It carried fear. This fear was not abstract. It manifested in measurable ways. Enemy activity in areas where the Australian SAS concentrated was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively attacked American positions in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, shifting from offensive aggression to defensive caution. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to examine the data honestly. But here was the problem. Examining that data honestly required acknowledging that Australian methods were producing better results than American methods, and acknowledging that required confronting the possibility that the entire philosophical foundation of American military operations in Vietnam was flawed. The Pentagon was not interested in that conversation, not in 1967, not in 1968, not even after the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that the war was being won. The breaking point came not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in a series of incidents that accumulated over months, each one driving the wedge deeper between Australian operational independence and American command expectations. The Australians had been given responsibility for Phuoc Tuy Province, and within that province, the SAS conducted patrols that American forces were not equipped to replicate. The Long Hai Mountains, a stretch of jungle-covered limestone extending toward the South China Sea, had become a sanctuary for the D445 Battalion and other Viet Cong units. American operations into the Long Hais had produced heavy casualties and minimal results. The terrain was a natural fortress, riddled with caves, tunnel complexes, and underground rivers that had been expanded and fortified over 2 decades of continuous warfare. American aerial reconnaissance had photographed every square meter. B-52 bombers had dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on the slopes. Marine and airborne units had conducted sweep and clear operations that accomplished little beyond adding names to casualty lists. The deep cave networks absorbed the bombing like a sponge absorbs water. Helicopter assault was suicidal, given the anti-aircraft positions covering every approach. Ground operations consumed men and accomplished nothing permanent. The mountains had swallowed patrols before. Men went in and did not come back. The terrain itself seemed to fight on the enemy's side, every ridgeline an ambush site, every cave mouth a defensive position, every trail a potential killing ground. The Maytao Mountains in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy presented similar challenges. These enemy strongholds sat in a vast tract of jungle that could not be isolated and lay outside the artillery and mortar range of the Australian base at Nui Dat. It was the SAS's task to detect and report enemy routes and dispositions in these areas, and it was precisely here that the tension between Australian silence and American demands for communication reached its most acute intensity. Patrols operating in these mountains were at their most vulnerable and their most valuable simultaneously. The intelligence they gathered shaped every major operation the task force conducted, but gathering it required the kind of sustained, silent immersion in enemy territory that the American command system found impossible to accommodate. The Australian SAS approached the Long Highs with an entirely different philosophy. Rather than attempting to destroy the enemy complexes through firepower, they would map them. Every entrance, every exit, every supply route, every personnel movement pattern. They would do this using 5-man patrols operating inside the Viet Cong's own security perimeter for periods of up to 3 weeks. The intelligence they gathered over months of these operations would eventually fill thousands of pages of classified reports. But to conduct these operations, the SAS needed something that the American command structure was constitutionally unable to provide. They needed to be left alone. A patrol inserting into the Long High Mountains for a 3-week reconnaissance mission could not maintain the level of radio contact that American doctrine demanded. The terrain made transmission difficult. The proximity to enemy positions made transmission dangerous. The nature of the mission, which required absolute concealment for days at a time while observing enemy activity from positions sometimes within meters of armed fighters, made any unnecessary electronic emission potentially fatal. Australian patrol commanders made a professional judgment that their patrol's survival depended on minimizing radio contact. American liaison officers and higher headquarters made a professional judgment that their ability to manage the battlefield depended on maintaining it. Both judgments were correct within their respective frameworks. The frameworks were simply incompatible. The friction came to a head during a series of long-range reconnaissance operations in late 1968. Australian SAS patrols were operating deep inside the Long High complex, gathering intelligence on the D445 Battalion that would prove critical to understanding the enemy's disposition and intentions throughout Phuoc Tuy province. Patrols would go silent for days, not because they were in trouble, not because their radios had failed, because they were lying motionless in concealed positions meters from enemy fighters, watching and recording and waiting, and any transmission could mean detection and death. For the patrol members, the silence was survival. For the American headquarters monitoring their operations, The silence was intolerable. Days without contact from a unit operating inside enemy lines triggered institutional anxiety that manifested as increasingly urgent demands for communication. Status reports were requested, then demanded, then ordered. The Australians continued to transmit only when they judged it safe to do so, which meant transmitting only when they had confirmed intelligence worth the risk and when their position afforded sufficient distance from enemy listening posts. The Australian Task Force chain of command understood their SAS. The Australian brigadier at Nui Dat understood the silence. He had been briefed on SAS methodology, trusted his operators, and accepted the operational pattern. The problem was that the Australian Task Force reported to the American 2nd Field Force, and 2nd Field Force did not understand, could not understand. The American system had no framework for a unit that deliberately went dark inside enemy territory because darkness was the point. The night it truly broke open, an Australian SAS patrol deep in the Long Highs had been silent for over 48 hours. The patrol was in position, observing a Viet Cong logistics hub, cataloging movement patterns that would shape operational planning for months to come. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. The American headquarters, unable to verify the patrol's status, began escalating through channels. Requests for contact became demands. Demands became directives. The directives filtered down through the Australian chain of command, losing none of their urgency, but colliding with the immovable reality that the men in the jungle could not respond without potentially dying. The Australian SAS squadron commander, back at Nui Dat, found himself caught between two imperatives. His men were operating under conditions that demanded silence. His Allied command structure was demanding noise. He made his choice. He informed the American liaison that his patrols would continue operating under Australian communications protocols. The patrols would report when they had intelligence to report, and when conditions permitted safe transmission. They would not break cover to satisfy administrative requirements that endangered their lives. The American response was predictable. Formal objections were filed. Meetings were convened. Senior officers expressed displeasure in the measured language that military bureaucracies use when they want to shout. The Australians attended these meetings, listened politely, explained their methodology, presented their results, and continued operating exactly as before. This was the power of the independence that Wilton and Westmoreland had negotiated in 1966. The Americans had operational control, not command. They could assign missions, they could not dictate methods, and the Australians knew it. What made this standoff particularly excruciating for American officers was the evidence. The SAS patrols that had gone silent kept returning with intelligence that transformed the operational picture. They had identified enemy headquarters locations, mapped supply routes, documented unit strengths and dispositions, and provided the kind of granular, actionable information that no amount of aerial reconnaissance or signals intelligence could replicate. Their methods were producing exactly the results that the entire Allied effort in Vietnam desperately needed, and those methods were fundamentally incompatible with the system designed to manage that effort. The Australian way of operating was built on a philosophy that treated the individual patrol as a thinking, autonomous entity that made decisions based on conditions on the ground. The American way of operating was built on a philosophy that treated the patrol as a component in a larger machine, feeding information upward so that decisions could be made at higher levels. The Australian philosophy trusted the man in the jungle. The American philosophy trusted the system in the headquarters. In the jungles of Vietnam, where conditions changed by the meter and by the minute, where the difference between life and death could be a single sound at the wrong moment, the Australian philosophy had the better argument. But philosophy does not change institutions. Institutions change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. For the American military in Vietnam, the cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic failure that might have forced immediate reform. Each compromised patrol was a separate incident. Each ambush triggered by radio emissions was an individual failure attributed to specific circumstances rather than to systemic doctrine. The pattern was visible only to those willing to look at the aggregate statistics, and senior commanders had professional reasons not to look too closely. The Australians continued to operate their way. They continued to go silent when silence served survival. They continued to resist attempts to integrate their operations into the American information machine, and they continued to produce results that American forces could not match. Over the course of 6 years, this quiet defiance, this refusal to sacrifice operational effectiveness on the altar of institutional conformity, became one of the defining characteristics of the Australian experience in Vietnam. It was never a single dramatic confrontation. There was no moment where an Australian officer slammed his fist on a table and declared he would not comply. That was not how it worked. It was a sustained, professional, implacable insistence on doing things the way that kept men alive. The American system demanded compliance. The Australians offered results instead. And in a war where results were increasingly difficult to come by, results had a currency that even the most rigid institutional thinking could not entirely dismiss. The deeper irony was that the silence the Americans found so disturbing was the source of the very intelligence they most desperately needed. The SAS patrols that went dark for days returned with information that shaped operations across the entire province. The 48 hours of radio silence that triggered institutional panic at 2nd Field Force also produced detailed mapping of enemy positions that made subsequent operations dramatically more effective. The system that demanded constant communication was being served by operators who achieved their results precisely by refusing to communicate. This paradox was never fully resolved during the war. The Americans continued to push for more reporting, more integration, more compliance with communications protocols designed for conventional operations. The Australians continued to resist, accommodate where they could, and ultimately operate as their training and experience demanded. The tension produced a steady accumulation of classified correspondence, formal complaints, after-action reports, and operational assessments that documented the philosophical collision without ever resolving it. What the paperwork never captured was what the silence felt like on the ground. A 5-man patrol lying in the undergrowth of the Long High Mountains, surrounded by Viet Cong fighters who could not see them, could not hear them, could not smell them, because the Australians had eliminated every chemical signature that might betray their presence. Men who had stopped using soap weeks before insertion. Men who had switched from Western cigarettes to local tobacco or quit entirely. Men who had eaten indigenous food until their body chemistry no longer registered as foreign to the jungle environment. Men who had cut the soles from their boots and walked on strips of tire rubber cut to match the profile of Vietnamese sandals so that their tracks were indistinguishable from enemy movement. Men who had sawed the barrels of their rifles short so the weapons would not snag on vines and create the tiny noises that could mean detection. These men lay in absolute stillness for hours, watching enemy fighters walk past at distances measured in meters. They observed ammunition distribution, meal preparation, sentry rotation patterns, the arrivals and departures of couriers and commanders. They recorded everything in silence, storing intelligence that would be transmitted only when they had moved to a position where the risk of detection was acceptable. And when headquarters, 40 kilometers away in a bunker with electric lights and hot coffee and the constant chatter of radios, demanded to know their status, they did not respond. Not because they could not, because responding might have been the last thing they ever did. The SEAL veteran Hayden, reflecting on his 10-day patrol with the Australian SAS, described their field craft as superior to anything he had encountered in American special operations at the time. He noted that the SEALs of that era simply did not possess the jungle skills to operate the way the Australians did. They lost men because of that gap. The Australians offered a model that could have saved lives, but the model required something that American military culture of the 1960s found almost impossible to accept. It required giving up control. It required trusting small units to operate autonomously. It required accepting that silence could be more valuable than information. It required believing that the man in the jungle knew better than the general in the headquarters. Some American officers did understand. Individual Green Berets, SEALs, and Marine Force recon operators who served alongside or observed the Australians recognized the value of their methods and advocated adoption. Some of these advocates were heard. Most were not. The institutional inertia was too great, the philosophical gap too wide, the implications too uncomfortable. It would take decades for the lessons to take hold. In the 1980s, when the American military began its serious reform of special operations capabilities, the reforms incorporated principles that the Australians had demonstrated effective in the 1960s. Emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, understanding that environmental adaptation could achieve results that technology alone could not deliver. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which restructured American military command and empowered special operations as a distinct community, created institutional space for the very ideas that had been dismissed when the Australians demonstrated them 2 decades earlier. The modern American Special Operations Community, Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the 75th Ranger Regiment, the entire apparatus of unconventional warfare, incorporates lessons that were available for learning in 1967. The irony cuts deep. The Australian SAS had provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School during the war itself, teaching American long-range reconnaissance patrol leaders the fieldcraft and jungle techniques that the SAS had perfected in Borneo and Vietnam. The Recondo course had its origins in Australian methodology. The principles were passed directly from Australian operators to American students. Individual Americans absorbed these lessons eagerly. They went back to their units with new skills and new understanding. But the institution surrounding those individuals was not structured to accommodate what they had learned. The system demanded conformity to existing doctrine. The existing doctrine demanded constant communication. The Australian lessons demanded selective silence. The contradiction was never resolved during the war. It was simply overridden by institutional momentum. The Australians were willing to teach. The institutions were not willing to learn. Not then. The silence that so troubled the American command structure in Vietnam eventually became doctrine in places like Fort Bragg and Coronado and Dam Neck. The operating principles that the Australians defended with quiet professional stubbornness became standard curriculum at the schools that train America's most elite warriors. The very methods that generated formal complaints and classified correspondence and heated exchanges in 1968 are now taught as best practice in classrooms where the next generation of special operators learns the art of disappearing. But in 1968, in the jungles of Pouaktui Province, those methods existed in a space between two military cultures that could not reconcile their fundamental differences. The Americans needed their patrols to talk. The Australians needed theirs to be silent. The Americans measured operational control through information. The Australians measured operational success through survival and enemy elimination. Both approaches had internal logic. Both were rational within their own frameworks. But the jungle, indifferent to institutional preferences and command arrangements, had its own logic. And the jungle sided with the ghosts. The Viet Cong knew which enemy they feared. They feared the ones they could not find. They feared the ones who appeared from nowhere and disappeared before response was possible. They feared the ones who left no tracks, made no sound, carried no scent, and operated with a patience that seemed inhuman. They feared the Ma Rung, and the Ma Rung operated in silence, not just the silence of the jungle where every sound was suppressed and every movement controlled, but the silence of the radio, where communication was weighed against survival, and survival always won. The 580 Australian SAS personnel who served in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They achieved kill ratios that no other unit, in any army, in any theater, could match. They lost a handful of men in 6 years of continuous operations inside enemy-held territory. They were feared by an enemy that feared almost no one else. And they accomplished all of this while consistently, professionally, and unapologetically refusing to operate in a way that their own experience told them would get their men killed. "We can't operate like this." Those were the words, or words very much like them, that passed between Australian officers and their American counterparts in meetings and briefings and liaison sessions throughout the war. The Australians were not defying America. They were not undermining the alliance. They were insisting, with evidence measured in enemy dead and friendly survivors, that there was a better way. That the better way required silence. That silence required trust. And that trust required the most powerful military on earth to accept that sometimes the smaller partner knew something it did not. The Pentagon spent decades classifying the lessons. The jungle had taught them for free. The Australians had offered to translate. The offer stood open for years. The institutions that needed the lessons most were the last to accept them. One killed in action out of 580 who served. Nearly 500 confirmed enemy dead. 1,200 patrols conducted. 0 words spoken for days and weeks at a time. That was what silence sounded like in Phuoc Tuy Province. That was what the Americans could not understand, and the Viet Cong could not survive. That was the sound of the jungle ghosts, Ma Rung. The phantoms operated in a silence so complete that even their allies could not hear them. And in that silence, they changed the way wars would be fought for the next half-century. But the silence extracted costs that no operational report could quantify. The men who spent weeks in the jungle without speaking, without making sound, without engaging in the basic human acts of conversation and connection, did not simply switch those capacities back on when they returned to base. The psychological adaptation required to become genuinely invisible, to suppress not just sound, but the normal operations of human consciousness, left marks that lasted far beyond any individual patrol. Veterans describe the experience as becoming something other than a conventional soldier. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in the jungle persisted for years and decades after service ended. The emotional suppression that prevented any behavioral signal from reaching enemy scouts made intimate relationships difficult or impossible in the civilian world they returned to. The silence that saved their lives in Phuoc Toi followed them home to Perth and Sydney and Brisbane, settling into the spaces where words should have been. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite the Australians serving in smaller numbers and sustaining far fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. The predatory patience that allowed them to wait motionless for hours in the jungle became an inability to tolerate the noise and chaos of normal civilian environments. The sensory acuity that detected enemy movement from extraordinary distances became a hyper-awareness that made crowded streets and shopping centers and family gatherings feel like assaults. They had learned to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness, perceiving without interpreting, observing without planning, responding without deliberating. That state was tactically invaluable. It was also, for many, impossible to fully leave behind. The Australian SAS provided instructors to the American MACV Recondo School, sharing their knowledge of long-range reconnaissance methodology with American forces who were eager to learn at the individual level, even as their institutions resisted change at the systemic level. They worked alongside American SEALs and Green Berets, and many of those Americans came away profoundly changed in their understanding of what was possible in unconventional warfare. The bond between Australian SAS and American Special Operations units remains strong to this day, built on the mutual respect that comes from having shared the same jungles and faced the same enemies. But in 1968 and 1969, in the classified correspondence and the tense liaison meetings and the formal complaints that flowed between Bien Hoa and Nui Dat, the fundamental question was never resolved. It was simply endured. Two allied forces, fighting the same war, against the same enemy, in the same jungles, operated according to two irreconcilable philosophies. One believed that control required communication. The other believed that survival required its absence. One measured effectiveness through information processed. The other measured it through enemies eliminated and friendlies returned alive. The jungle, as always, kept its own score, and by every measure that mattered, by every metric that counted bodies and calculated ratios and assessed territorial control, the score favored the ghosts who operated in silence over the machine that demanded noise. The Americans just were not ready to listen.